Hi, welcome back to this week's episode of Cheap, Fast, and Healthy. I'm Maria and I'll be today's instructor. Today we will be making vegan holiday thumbprint cookies. Before we begin, let's go over some of the ingredients. You will need 2 cups of almond flour, a pinch of salt, a 1/4 cup of pure maple syrup, a 1/4 cup of coconut oil, 2 teaspoons of vanilla extract, 1 teaspoon of almond extract, which is optional, you don't have to put that in, and then you're gonna need some raspberry jam or preserves. I chose to use preserves because I like the seeds in it, but you don't have to do that, you can use something else. Before we start baking, make sure to wash your hands for at least 20 seconds with warm and soapy water. Make sure to get around your wrist, between your fingers, and underneath your fingernails. Now that we've washed our hands thoroughly, let's get started with our recipe. So I just preheated my oven to 350 degrees. Now I'm going to start preparing my ingredients. First I'll start with the dry and then I'll go to the wet. For my dry ingredients, you'll be using 2 cups of almond flour. So a good way to measure it is by putting your measuring cup over your bowl and spooning your flour in so that you don't get too much. Flour tends to get kind of packed down when you just scoop it directly out of the bag, so this is a good way to make sure that your cookies don't get so dense. And the reason why I'm using almond flour rather than normal flour is that it's a really good substitute for generic flour because it has a lot more nutrients in it and it's just a lot better for you. So that's one, and then I'll do the 2nd cup and then I'll come back. Now that I've measured out my 2 cups of flour, I'm going to add in my salt. The reason why we do it in a separate bowl is so that when you mix together your dry and wet ingredients, there won't be a big clump of salt in your cookie. So I'm just gonna add that in. The reason why I'm limiting the salt to only a pinch is because the RDA recommends that you have only about 2,400 milligrams of sodium a day, and most Americans consume around 3,500. So definitely try to watch your sodium intake in your recipes. Another good thing about almond flour rather than generic flour is that it's a lot lower in carbohydrates. So I'm just gonna mix this up quick, and then we'll move on to our wet ingredients. So I'll set that aside and then I'll clean off my surface and then we'll go on to our wet ingredients. Okay, so now we'll move on to our wet ingredients. You'll want to get a little bit bigger bowl, and I'm going to be using pure maple syrup. Make sure that you get a maple syrup that doesn't have any additives such as corn syrup in them. So I'm going to measure out about a 1/4 cup of this. A better way to measure out something that's using liquid is to get eye level with it and measure it so that you don't use too much or too little. So that's about a 1/4 cup. And we'll add that into our bowl. So pure maple syrup contains a lot of antioxidants, and it also has a lower glycemic index of about 54, whereas table sugar has a glycemic index of about 65. So you're trying to look for something with a lower glycemic index that, if that's what you're shooting for, because it can keep your blood sugar at a steady rate for longer. So that's one of the benefits of using pure maple sugar or maple syrup rather than table sugar. Now I'm going to measure out a 1/4 cup of coconut oil. If your coconut oil looks something like this when you get it, where it's in a solid state, you're going to scoop it into a liquid measuring cup or into, a microwave safe cup, and you're going to heat it up for about like 8 to 10 seconds so that it becomes a liquid. So I'm going to do that considering mine is solid right now before I add it into my recipe. So coconut oil contains medium chain triglycerides that are shorter fatty acids, and that makes it a lot better for heart health. So I'm going to start off with that much, and it might look like too much, but it will melt down to probably about a 4th cup. So I just got done heating up my coconut oil, and it should look something like this. It ended up taking me about 1 minute and 30 seconds, but just do it in small increments so that it's not too hot when you put it in your mixture. So now I'm going to add my oil to my maple syrup. And lastly, I'm going to add in my 2 teaspoons of vanilla extract, and if you chose to put almond extract in it, there's about 1 teaspoon of that. So I'm going to add that in. And now I'm just going to give this a quick mix before we add all the ingredients together. So now I'm going to slowly fold in my dry ingredients into my wet. So I'm going to start off with about 1/3 of the dry mixture. And we'll fold that in. I'm just doing this so that there's not any weird clumps in the recipe. It's better to add it slower than too quickly. The rest. So when you're done folding all that in, it should look something like this. So now is the fun part. I'm going to grab a baking sheet and then a tablespoon measuring spoon and pick up about a tablespoon of my dough and roll it into a small ball with my hands. And then I'll place it on my baking sheet. And then with a 1/2 teaspoon measuring spoon, I'm going to press a divot in so that we can add our jam. You can smooth it out with your finger. And then if you get some cracks in the side like this, just try to mold it back into shape with your finger. I'm gonna do that with the rest of my dough and then I'll be back. So when you're done with that, it should look something like this. Now I'm going to put these in the oven for about 10 to 15 minutes. You might want to keep your eye on them just because some ovens can show up a little hotter than others, so yeah. I'm going to put on my oven light as well so that I can keep an eye on them a lot better. So I just took out my cookies out of the oven, and it might happen where your divot has kind of spread out, but right when you take them out, you can take your scoop again and carefully dig it back down just so that you're able to put the jam in. And it'll still work if it's still hot. And then after we do this, we're gonna let our cookies cool for about 5 minutes, and then we'll put our jam in them. And I'm going to let them cool on the tray. So I've I've waited about 5 minutes, so I'm ready to start putting in my jam or preserves. I ended up deciding to use the Smucker's Red Raspberry Preserves. This is my favorite because it still has the seeds in it. So I'm going to loosen it up a little bit. Take my ½ teaspoon and I'll just plop it in the center. You can kind of flatten it out in the cookie. And then I will do that with the rest of these. So this is just an extra step and you don't have to do this, but in order for this jam to get super smooth, I'm gonna pop this bit back in on a lower rack for a minute or two, just so that the jam is super smooth on top. So I took my cookies out of the oven and let them sit for about 15 minutes, and now they're ready to enjoy. Thank you for joining me on this week's episode of Cheap, Fast, and Healthy, where we made vegan holiday thumbprint cookies. If you make this recipe, remember to tag us on social media at UND Wellness. Also remember to check us out on YouTube at UND Wellness. See you next week.